Let me first of all acknowledge John Fitch and Tom Padgett, council members in the audience. I don't see Rhonda and Keith, but thank you guys for coming. You know, Tom and I a year ago were running for the office of mayor, and what you always talk about when you run for mayor is you're going to create jobs, and what's the best way to create jobs, and all those discussions that you have. And then sometimes when you get elected you forget to do that. But I really have a desire, and I think our council does, to not only chase the smokestack industries that we need to continue to chase to create large employers in our community, but that we would somehow foster an environment in this community where entrepreneurs not only would feel welcome, but we would be a partner with them to begin that business process. And we're not talking the next gateway necessarily, although if that happens, we'd be as excited as anybody. If you all remember the story of Ted, it was $10,000 that grandma gave him, and that's how he got started. And we have people, I think, in this community that need $10,000 to start a business, and unfortunately, for whatever reason, it's difficult to borrow money on a startup business. So I feel like we need to, as a city, partner with the state and the Chamber of Commerce. I see Mr. McGowan here today. They need to be our partner in that, and we need to figure out ways where we can make that happen in this community so that young people have the opportunity to create jobs in our community 20 years from now look different, I think, if we're successful in this endeavor. So I thank our city staff, and we had a little preliminary meeting with a group of people, and I want to thank them for encouraging us to continue down this road. First thing, I want to thank Sioux City Grow today for their sponsorship of that. They have been an integral part in entrepreneurship, and we would certainly encourage them to stay involved with us in this process. So thank the convention center staff, but most important, thank you for coming and listening to what we were going to talk about today. We think this can and will have a significant impact in the future of our community, so thank you for coming.
And now I get the pleasure of introducing our keynote speaker. Tom Chapman is the Vice President of Operations at Nebraska Global, a software investment firm based in Lincoln, Nebraska, specializing in developing complex software companies that create real, lasting economic development impact in the region. Formerly, Tom served as the Director of Entrepreneurship and Innovation with the Greater Omaha Chamber of Commerce, where he successfully employed a people-centric approach to building a local entrepreneurial ecosystem. He is a recognized leader in entrepreneurial development, and he's here in Sioux City to share his expertise and experiences as we ramp up our own entrepreneurial initiative. Joining Tom for the Q&A session is Andy Stoll. Andy is a media producer. There's a long list, so you'll enjoy this. Andy is a media producer, entrepreneur, a sought-after speaker on leadership, creativity, cities, community building, entrepreneurship, and a fair amount of travel, so I understand. Andy joins us from Cedar Rapids, where he co-founded Startup Iowa, which is a dynamic force in the Cedar Rapids startup scene. So we're excited to have two such recognized leaders in the entrepreneurial development arena here joining us in Sioux City. So please join me in welcoming our Andy Stoll and our keynote speaker, Tom Chapman.
Good morning. Let's try this and make sure it works. Good morning. Okay, good. Nice to see you all today. I'm Tom Chapman, and before we get going, I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself, and I'm going to ask you to do something. So, I'm not a software guy, so this was a new experience for me, but I work in a software company, and I actually work in 7 of them. So, what we do every morning when we start the day is we do a stand-up. So does anybody work in a software company and do stand-ups to start the day? Good, this is going to be a new experience for everybody. So everybody stand up. So what we do inside of our software company is a thing called agile methodology. So what that means from a development roadmap perspective is essentially we have a basic roadmap, and then every day we go around and we sort of say, what are you doing today? Okay, so that's sort of what a stand-up is for. But we're going to do it a little bit differently today, because there's a little too many people for me to be like, what are you doing today? What are you doing today? So I'm going to ask some questions, and I'm going to ask people to stand up or sit down. So you maybe like, oh, whoop, whoop, whoop. And I apologize. This is just really an excuse for you to get your brain going, actually. But the first question is If you are an entrepreneur, please stand up. If you are not, please sit down. So look around the room, look around the room. I don't need to know this, you need to know this. All right, everybody stand back up. If you live in Sioux City proper, please stand up. Anybody else, sit down. Stand up. If you do not live in the greater Siouxland area, please sit down. So, this is a room full of people who are local. It's a room full of people, frankly, who have a lot of entrepreneurs. I've given this talk before all over the country, and there are sometimes when literally nobody's standing up. When you say, who's an entrepreneur, everybody sits down. That's a tough environment, but that means you guys already have the building blocks because you have people who are focused locally and who are thoughtful about entrepreneurship because you've been entrepreneurs. So go ahead and everybody sit down. Now we're going to do some talking. I have to do 3 things before I get started. The first thing is I have to pre-apologize, which is apologizing before you do the bad thing that you know you're going to do. I have a very good chance of cussing today. I apologize ahead of time. It usually just comes out. It's partly because I work for a software startup, and it's also because I'm totally undisciplined. So you should know those 2 things. The second thing is I live in Omaha. I work in Lincoln. I want to basically say ahead of time, please understand that I have biases based on those things. Feel free to say he's an idiot because that's absolutely true. I do not know Sioux City. I don't know the Siouxland. Apparently I shouldn't know Sioux Falls. So this is a story about principles and tenets, not a story about you have to do these things. There's some things at the end that I'll say you really probably shouldn't do this. So like as a little tidbit, I would not personally go out and count patents again. I have done it. I wouldn't do it because it's not useful and it's painful. But feel free. I mean, you guys go out and spend a couple months doing that, and you'll understand that it really doesn't get you anywhere. There's some of those sorts of little tidbits of wisdom that I don't think have anything to do with Omaha per se, or Nebraska per se. Some of this story has to revolve around what I know. Because that's what I know. I'm sorry. So if you're like, gosh, I can't believe he's talking about Nebraska again. So anybody who's from South Sioux, you might get a little bit more out of some of those. But the last thing that I want to say as sort of a thing is, we're talking about entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurship is going to require change. It's going to require change from a thought process with regards to economic development. And one of those changes we're going to start today as I'm talking. What I want you to do is interrupt me. Ask a question when you have the question. Don't wait until the Q&A. Now, you can save some Q&A questions that are big, but if you're like, what the heck are you talking about? Raise your hand, because I'm confusing and there's stuff all over the place. Please, interrupt. I will not be offended. All right, so with that, who am I? So, that was a great introduction, Sam. Thank you very much for the introduction. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about myself than you probably need to know, because it will explain how I ended up here. First, I'm one of 6 kids. I'm number 2, and I'm the dumbest one in my family. My oldest sister, Kim, lettered in sports 12 times in high school and was in Time magazine at 15 for science. She is a pediatric geneticist. My brother Jim scored a perfect score on the SATs. I'm not joking. I'm the dumbest one in my family. Second reason I'm here is the Greater Omaha Chamber of Commerce. When I was in law school, I have a JD and an MBA. When I was in law school, I didn't want to go and be a lawyer. I knew that ahead of time. My dad was a lawyer. I knew that wasn't where I wanted to be. But I also knew that I wanted something that required me to think a certain way. And so during that time, I worked at the Omaha Chamber of Commerce, and I recognized inside of economic development that there was this big miss. And the big miss was when you look at jobs, where do jobs come from? A huge percentage, more than 50% and closer to 80%, come out of startups and small businesses. This is not the sort of thing that I can document fact after fact after fact, but I think in our hearts we know that this is true. And the critical leap is not just where do jobs come from, it's actually where does wealth come from. So wealth is the key behind economic development. People don't create jobs just to have a job. They create jobs to create wealth within a community. And wealth comes from the transfer of dollars into a community from somewhere else. It doesn't come from just cycling through dollars internally. And what that means is you have to do what I call high-growth startups. High-growth startup means you are exporting something. You're exporting a service, you're exporting a product, you're doing something, and then it scales. In order to do that, typically there are some metrics that you can start to identify. So I'm going to put I put up here on the board two things. In 2006 in Omaha, we had $0 of venture capital and 0 investments. If you kind of ratchet it up a little bit, we had 2 angel investments at $800,000. That was the total investment when we started. That was typical for the 5 years. So if you take like a 10 or 20 year window and you look at the median was about $4 million worth of investment. This is not, by the way, the metric that I think you have to use. It's just a metric that I think is representative. When I left in 2011, we did 18 deals at $37 million. So $37 million versus $0 is a significant change. But anything over 0 is a significant statistical change. What I would say the critical leap is that energizing an ecosystem is much less about quantity. So it's not about having 600 startups, it's about having 18 good ones and knowing that there are 18 more coming next year, or 6 good ones and 6 more coming next year. That the quality of those startups is more important than the quantity. So in 2001, Omaha had 1 startup that received $154 million. Does that mean the ecosystem was suddenly better in 2001 than it was in 2000 and 2002 when it had less than $3 million? No, it just means you had this accident. I would say that if you look at these numbers, and 2012 is not done, and by the way, I don't really collect this data anymore, so this is just what I know. I didn't really go through and do any math. If you look at these numbers, we're going to annualize at about between $30 and $50 million, which was our target 5 years ago for 5 years from now. I'm going to tell you about how we did that, but that's why I'm here. I'm here because when you look around the country and you say, who's done this? Almost no one. So before we were talking about Sioux City, and he was like, was it Sam? No, it was Marty said, we're a little behind on this. You are not. You're not a little behind. The entire country is a little behind. Omaha is maybe half a step ahead of you. Cedar Rapids is maybe a quarter step ahead of you. And we're doing it well, to give you an idea of where the rest of the country is. Andy and I speak all over the country. Kansas City, Miami, Boulder, California. So, I mean, I have a good perspective on what this looks like. You are not behind. You're walking right in lockstep with everybody else. So we're going to talk about some of these principles. Here's some themes, and this is where it gets a little bit difficult. This is where changing mindset is going to be a little bit hard. These are things I'm going to talk about today. So I'm just going to read them. I'm not going to talk about them now. I just want you to know that I recognize these are throughout, and I want you to recognize them throughout. Honesty. This isn't honesty necessarily like I'm honest with Andy. That's obviously something that business is built on. It's about being introspective as a community and understanding what you really are. So one of the hardest, and maybe the hardest, but one of the hardest conversations we had in Omaha, and I stood in front of a Chamber of Commerce, and I said, we are terrible at entrepreneurship. And I had all these guys going, no, we're not terrible. By the way, it was all guys in suits, so I'm glad to see there are very few suits in the room today. So good job, people not wearing suits. People wearing suits, I feel bad for you. I'm one of you. I'm there. But it was very difficult because people said, oh, no, we got Peter Kiewit Institute. Peter Kiewit Institute creates tons of companies. In the last decade, Peter Kiewit Institute has created 3 companies. Conventional wisdom says we are creating all sorts of companies from the Peter Kiewit Institute. Not true. However, we aren't being honest with ourselves if we allow that conventional wisdom to exist. So we got openness. Openness is difficult, particularly in the economic development world, because everything's about code names and shared secrets. We got human-centric. Startups are about people. Startup focused and led. It's critically important that you have entrepreneurs in the room today. That's great. It's also critically important that you listen to what they say, because they probably know what they need better than I do. Because I have no idea. There's different needs here than there are anywhere I am. Community strength orientation. So, before I was talking to Ann, and I said, Ann, where's Ann? Is Ann in the room? I want to make sure I reference Ann. Ann, what are the strengths of Sioux City? And Ann said, and then I said, who are the best entrepreneurs? And she said, well, and she kind of said, well, that's a hard question. What do you mean, etc. But what I heard actually was food. Food is a strength. I wish food was a strength in Omaha. It should be a strength in Omaha. I have tried like crazy to find startups in the food industry in Omaha. I've looked everywhere I could find them. There's a couple, but there is not a robust ecosystem for food anywhere in the country. The possible exception is Indianapolis, by the way. So if you find that out, if you find that to be true, I'm open to the fact that that might be true. But it is not Omaha. People say, oh, well, you're in the Midwest. You must have a ton of ag startups. We don't. Handful. They're not bad. You got companies like Green Plains Energy, you got companies like Bass Labs, you have companies in the space, but we don't have an ecosystem inside of food. And I'll tell you what, you say, what's one of the big problems over the next 50 years? Food is a huge problem globally. So if you fix food and are incredibly good at technology and all the pieces of it, logistics, development, all that, this is going to be a kick-ass place for entrepreneurship. Again, I'm not telling you to go do food. It's just, that's what she said. So think about that. Be introspective. And then humility. Humility is really hard, particularly for somebody like me, who's kind of arrogant. Sometimes you got to step back and say, that's not me. It's not my job to do that. All right, so I'm going to ask some questions. These are questions that were asked of us that were really helpful. Number one, who are your entrepreneurs? Think in your head, who are they? I don't know the answer. So I heard Ted Waite earlier. Last time I checked, Ted Waite lives in La Jolla. We got people like Avalon that are still here. The fact that he lives in La Jolla doesn't change the fact that he may be an incredible mentor, he may be an entrepreneur, he may be all these things, but that's not who's on the ground right now. So we could point to people in Omaha that we're like, oh yeah, this guy's a great entrepreneur, and he hasn't started a business for 42 years. That's not a bad thing. It just means he hasn't started a business in 42 years because he's been wildly successful, but it also means he may not know what's going on the ground. So in our context, one of the entrepreneurs that we found, I told Ann this, I said, the three people that were referenced, that I tend to say are our best entrepreneurs, one is a woman named Julie Malik. So first off, when we bring people from the outside into Omaha and they drive around, they say, oh my God, one of your best entrepreneurs is a woman. People are just shocked because there are very few women entrepreneurs in the country right now. That's a problem for our country, right? But Julie Malik maybe is our #1 entrepreneur in Omaha. Does anybody know who Julie Malik is? Julie Malik has raised more than $40 million, has had 3 successful ventures. You've probably bought stuff from Julie Malik at some point. Her current company is a company called Bloom.com. What Bloom does is social commerce. So inside of Facebook, you can get groups together. So like I can be groups with my family, I can buy stuff. What they have done is they have said, all right, you're buying cosmetic products. I am not an expert in cosmetic products, surprisingly. And so my wife will buy a face rinse, and they'll say, here's 23 people that have bought that face rinse that have also bought the same color blush. This is what they bought for eyeshadow. So you can start to identify people who have similar tastes rather than who live down the block or in your parish or whatever it is, that you start to say, here are people that I buy like. Maybe I should check with them. Maybe I should grow a friendship with them. These are people who share other things. It's called social commerce. It's crazy hard to do because the analytics needed to do it. It's incredibly difficult, and that's the startup she's working on right now. Her last 2 startups have both gone over $100 million in sales, and we had a room very much like this. Julie is the humblest person. I mean, literally, I've sat in rooms with interviewers, like people coming from magazines, and they can't identify which one's Julie. I mean, like, to give you an idea of how humble this woman is. But there's 4 people. They're like, Julie. Nobody knew who she was. Second one, a guy named Bill Fisher. Bill Fisher started ACI. People know ACI? ACI makes ATM software, and that's how they started. They do a lot of other stuff now. But they were the first company that created ATM software. Bill grew that company to $1 billion, retired, started 3 or 4 more companies, now invests. He's invested more than $150 million in startups in primarily the Omaha area. There are a couple that are in Denver and some other places, but we had a room like this. He sat in the very back table. He's about this tall. He stood up. He waved. Again, nobody knew who he was. You say, your startup community is not necessarily built with the guy that has the highest profile startup. It's built with somebody that you may not even recognize if they're sitting at your table right now, because that person is actually heavily engaged doing stuff. So, Bill, as an example, is constantly present inside of startup stuff. He's one of the most active funders. He's one of the most active starters. And yet, even inside of sort of the community that goes out to economic development events and things of that nature, they don't know who he is. This is why change is going to probably be happening. It's going to happen because you may not know who they are in your community right now. You might say, oh, the entrepreneur is that person, or that person, or that person. You may be really good, and if you are, great. You're way better than we were in 2006. Because the second question, where do they hang out? We literally could not answer. We said, I have no idea. We made an answer up. We said, oh, they're in the old market. They're not. They're at the 120th and Blondo Scooters. They're in the Mastercraft building today. They are located inside of a coffee shop that is in the old market, but it's usually on specific days called aromas. If you're people-centric, then you focus on events. Okay? Because if you're people-centric, you need to get people together. You need to know what people are saying. You need to have an environment where you can ask the question, what do you need? I'm going to give you a little secret here. This little tidbit, this is true anywhere in the country. What do you need? Money. The answer is money. The answer actually is not money. The answer from them will be money. Push. What do you need the money for? There's a couple things that people generally need money for. One of them is, I don't know what to do next. If I have more money, then I have a lot longer runway. Second thing is, I have a problem finding a sales guy, and the only sales guy I can find costs $180,000 to go and hire. That is a problem. Sales is an incredibly difficult thing inside of an entrepreneur. I was having a conversation. I sell stuff for my startup, okay? So I said, I had this sales guy, and he was like, well, I grew my, my company from 10 million to 215 million. I said, have you ever sold a product where you can't prove it works? He's like, well, yes, I've done da-da-da-da. I said, no, but you already had those in place when you started. Have you ever sold a product literally the first time walking out and going like, yeah, you can't look at our Hoovers, we got nothing. Like, you got to bet on us that we're going to get this thing done. And he's like, well, no, I haven't done that. That is so hard to do. Trust me, because I've done it. It's incredibly difficult. And you know what? Every single great startup we talk about has had to do that. At some point, somebody had to bet on it. So hard. What does success look like? This is what this room is for, this question. What does success look like? Here's what I hope you don't answer. But if you do, well, I'll think grand things about other places. We want to be the next Silicon Valley. You really don't. You really don't. You want to be the very best Sioux City, Siouxland, fill in the blank that you can be. I don't know what that means. I really don't. I have no idea. You do. When you wake up in the morning, you say, we want to have an awesome downtown. And that awesome downtown needs dynamism that looks like this. We want to have an incredible football team, because then the mayor's really happy. I mean, whatever it is, those are the sorts of things that you need to answer, that I'm not going to give you any insight into. So, quickly, some starting points. What are your community strengths? I gave this speech this summer in central Nebraska, and I had a guy stand up. He said, you should move to my town. And I'm not going to say who the town is. You should move to my town. I said, okay, tell me why. He said, we got roads. We got quality of life. We got internet. Guess what? Every single city in America says those same things. Sioux City's awesome, by the way. I looked you up on Wikipedia. You guys are like #1 best city to live, 50,000 or 200,000. You guys are awesome. Taking nothing away from that. But don't convince me of that. Convince you of that. What are the things that you have that are particularly strong? World class here that nobody else can replicate. Food. If you are world class in food, figure out what that means. I don't know if that's true. Here's what we have. Silicon Prairie News, world class. People from all over the world come and talk to them because they're like, how did you do that? You guys did what? You started in an office space and you created this tech blog? And what do you do? Do you guys know what Silicon Prairie News does? Yeah. Silicon Prairie News basically writes a blog that says, here are the entrepreneurs in our community. It's an incredibly powerful tool for our community. But in addition, they put on one of the best conferences in the world on this topic, Big Omaha. It's in May. They have 2 more, Big KC, Big Iowa. It used to be Think Iowa. That are not quite as good, honestly, but are pretty good. They have good speakers. Number 2, US Stratcom. World class. You know what they do? Protect nuclear weapons and nuclear assets. That's kind of a tough market. They are also the United States place, like you said, who's responsible for cybersecurity in the United States military? Stratcom. What we found is, as you go around, the resident expertise is not necessarily on base that often. But that is who holds the responsibility. So how do you leverage that knowledge of knowing resident expertise not there, strategic expertise there? That's a different deal. Accessibility. Omaha is a world-class city for accessibility. I can make one call and get into any of the Fortune 1000 CEOs. It's not because of who I am, because I'm not really anybody. It's not because of who you are. It's because for whatever reason, Omaha had realized a long time ago that being accessible at that level is critically important. It has an incredibly horizontal structure with regards to how you get access into businesses. I don't know why. I have no explanation. All I can tell you is, I have walked startups into the CEO of Mutual of Omaha, the CEO of TD Ameritrade, the CEO that have no business being there, and I am embarrassed. And they were like, "God, that was a great meeting, Tom. Thanks for bringing it." Incredibly accessible. The Hayneedle people. There are 3 founders of Hayneedle. Julie was one. Mark Hazebrook. He's part of Techstars. He has Dundee Venture Capital. He started 2 other businesses. You probably saw one of his businesses, E-Creameries, on Shark Tank. And Doug Nielsen. Doug Nielsen is currently the CEO of Hayneedle. But these guys are super powerful in our ecosystem. They are world-class with regards to how they are engaged. That doesn't mean their business is better than Google's business. That's not what we're comparing. We're saying inside of our ecosystem, what's your strength? Here's the key learning though. Know what your not strengths are. This is critically important. This isn't a weakness. This is stuff that people will come to the outside and be like, food is your strength. You might be like, no, it's not. You're an idiot. You know who's not a strength of Omaha and the entrepreneurial ecosystem? Warren Buffett. Not a strength. In fact, I would argue that his grandson Howard is far more impactful on our ecosystem than he is. Now, he's created crazy amounts of wealth. And that wealth does not get invested in startups. Not never. There's guys like Tom Rogers, Odin Capital. I mean, not never. But he has not been particularly impactful. And yet, if you have somebody come in from the coast, they'll say, Warren Buffett is the critical part of your ecosystem. He's not accessible. He's not interested. If you talk to him about startups, and I have actually talked to him on this topic. If you talk to him about startups, he generally says, that's great. When you have this amount of EBITDA, then I'll be interested. Mm-hmm. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. That's who he is. But he's not a strength for our ecosystem. Universities. What's the story of Silicon Valley? The story of Silicon Valley is sort of Park Lab, HP, Stanford, Livermore Labs. It's universities. So when people say, you want to start an entrepreneurial ecosystem, your university has to be the centerpiece. I don't think that's true. I think if you go to Boulder, they'll talk a lot about the University of Colorado, but if you actually say, what was the impact of the University of Colorado in the late 1980s, they will not say, without it, we would not have succeeded. They sort of are nice about it, but that's not what's true. If you go to places like Israel or Singapore, these are markets you can replicate. Universities are not the critical piece. This is not good in Omaha. It's not bad. We have a great university system. Creighton's wonderful. You know, there are great things happening. But they don't turn out startups. They aren't particularly helpful in the startup space because of that thing I mentioned earlier called humility. They always want to lead. They want to lead you right down a path that says, now we're going to fill that building. Now we're going to get money to be into this entrepreneurial program. They've changed dramatically over the last 6 years. In some ways, I would say this is the biggest change that's happened inside of eastern Nebraska with regards to the way that J.B. Milliken thinks and the leaders of the university think. That has not manifested into huge changes inside of the way the university does stuff. They still do not produce a lot of startups. This is not me saying, your universities are probably terrible and you shouldn't work with them. That's absolutely not what I'm saying. Our universities were a not strength. Everybody told us this has to be your strength. It was a not strength. Agriculture. I told you that story already. Weaknesses. Biomedical. I sat in the office with the chancellor of UNMC, the University of Nebraska Medical Center. He said, Tom, we need to grow companies in AIDS. I said, really? I said, tell me about that. We just got a $13 million grant to do AIDS research. We need to have startups. We need to do... I said, I don't think that's right. In fact, if we started a company right now, I think we would be best advised to push them to the coast, to push them to the Baltimore, D.C. area. There are 53 federal research labs that have more than $1 billion to study AIDS. Inside of Johns Hopkins alone, there's $1.6 billion. Inside of that market, there are at least 13 venture capital companies that have AIDS portfolio companies. That market is a better place for an AIDS company than one that all we can point to is this little piece of research we're doing. This is what honesty is about. It's not about telling that to yourself. It's about saying that to the chancellor when you're in the room. And I did. I was there with Admiral Bob Bell, so if any of you guys know, Admiral Bob Bell was the head of US Stratcom when it was sacked. He got really, really angry. So I'm just going to start by saying that. About 6 months later, he came up to my dad. We were eating at a restaurant. He was eating there as well. Came up to my dad and he said, "Your son is the best adversary I've ever had." And I was like, I'm so proud. Worries me a little bit about what China's doing right now. Institutional capital. We don't have institutional capital that invests in startups. If you go out to the coast, you see places like CalPERS, or you see pension and retirement. Nebraska doesn't have that. There are no dollars in early stage or alternative investments, and most of the institutional dollars. Mutual of Omaha doesn't do it, etc. If you have that, that's great. Avalon here, great. Perfect. We didn't have it. So that was a weakness. Then Berkshire Hathaway. Berkshire Hathaway had convinced people that the way to invest was to buy stock cheap, let it grow forever. And so there was just a mentality that said, well, this is how you do it. And so we had to overcome those things. So those are 3 things that we learned. Essentially, everybody includes the same stuff. I'm going to tell you the 5 that I think are right, but feel free, again, to be like, no, this is kind of wrong. Human capital, hardest one. This is where cities, communities, countries, everybody fails. European Union, at the time, had 20 countries in it. I think it has 23 or 26 now, but at the time that this study was done, 17 of them said, we are going to be the leading force for entrepreneurship and innovation in the European Union. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to have a great plan, and we're going to build buildings. We're going to do all of these things. And they never asked the question, who's going to be in the building? They never spent any time understanding what their strengths were. And literally within 10 years, this is a little old in my brain, but I want to say it was 9 billion euros was invested, and 0 came out of it. They had all stopped their programs. It's because this is super, 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 super hard. By far the hardest thing. So if you said, we're going to nail one thing on this map, if you nail this, everything else will follow. I'm going to tell you kind of a counterexample. Does everybody know the company PayPal? There's a guy named Max Levkin, who was at the University of Illinois, had started a couple companies. He went out to Silicon Valley, slept on a dude's couch. This is sort of the traditional story. The part that I love about this story is he went to a presentation by Peter Thiel. There were a total of 6 people at the presentation. At the time, what he wanted to be able to do is he wanted to be able to exchange revenue and exchange dollars, basically, by pushing his phones together. So like bumping phones, that's what he wanted. Peter Thiel and Max met at this meeting that was a complete accident. 2 days later, they sat down at a diner and said, what about if we do this? And they started the path that led to PayPal. There were 6 people in that room. Everybody talks about the Valley and talks about quantity, lots and lots of people. It is not a quantity problem. When we started the conversations in Omaha, there were literally 5 people in the room, 5. I could name them because I was one of the 5. And we said, we really need to do this. And when people now talk about how successful Omaha is at these sorts of things, they typically talk about where we are now. They don't talk about what it looked like then. That's the problem with entrepreneurship. Success takes a long time. Even to have minuscule success like we've had in Omaha takes a long time. 6, 7 years. You're talking 20 years. I think Brad Feld says this is a 20-year plan. So, if you're doing a 20-year plan, you're talking about agile methodology. You need a plan. These are the things we care about. This is what success looks like. Here's the stuff we're going to do. But you also need to be able to adjust. Why are we finding all these things over here in payment systems? Let's go do some research. Oh my gosh, we're awesome at payment systems. Why are we finding all these things in built landscape technology? Oh, we're awesome at that. You'll find stuff that I couldn't predict when I started that is absolutely true, and I can document and show you why it should have been true and blatantly obvious to me then. But it wasn't. All right, so 4 things in human capital. First one, serial entrepreneurs, goal. Bob Scott, goal. I'm not running his mayoral re-election campaign 4 years from now, but goal. It's hard to find. There aren't that many. Gallup published a study that said that the United States increased its GDP by $10 trillion on the backs of 1,000 people. Half of those people were immigrants. That's a totally different story. I mean, it's just a different story. We could go all day on just immigrants and startups. But think about how few that is. And then think about how many of them are probably in Sioux City. It's not a very big number. 1, 3. I don't know how many are in Omaha, but it's less than 10. So, it's not a quantity thing. Find those people. They may not be easy to find. They may be sitting in the back table. Nobody will know who they are. Know who they are. 2, genealogical trees are really important. So we talked about McLeod USA, and I think this is a great example. Andy was talking about Cedar Rapids, and McLeod USA is this epic failure in Cedar Rapids, except that the story is 12 of the 14 best tech startups in Cedar Rapids today were started by alumni of McLeod USA. Think about Gateway. I don't know if that's a seed. Think about other things in your community. In Omaha, some really incredible ones. I mentioned Enron earlier. Enron is an epic failure in Omaha. Not because they were an epic failure 25 years later. It is one of the sores on the eyes of anybody that does economic development or things in Omaha, is that Enron left in 1985. People still bemoan that decision. And yet, from those ashes, look at the things that have grown out. Billions of dollars, incredible wealth. I don't know who it is here. I keep saying that. Maybe I should just be quiet. I think you got that point. Genealogical trees are a little bit hard to track because you typically get information today that you really need to find out what's 20 years in the past. So you got to be really deliberate about it. So as you start to see 2 or 3 companies that have the same tree, go back and find the other 15 because they will be there. They'll be sitting in some odd spot. Number 3, a lot of the discussion about incubators is really about mentoring. So I tend to say there are a couple pieces of mentoring that are sometimes put into positions that are different. You have mentors, you have models, and you have advisors. So a mentor can be somebody that's like a one-on-one, like I'm your mentor. That sometimes works. I would say that actually has an iffy proposition in the sense that you have to have certain types of things that line up. It gets a little weird if you're talking about investment. And there's some weird things there inside of this circle. It doesn't never work, but I would say it's iffy. It's more like 50-50. So there are programs out there in mentoring that are really built to give you one-on-one. What I would say seems to work better is what I would call venture mentoring. So venture mentoring is the sort of thing like what Pipeline does. Do you guys know what Pipeline does? Pipeline is a regional collaboration, mostly Kansas, up to Omaha, a little bit in Nebraska. They're looking at Iowa, some in Missouri. And what they do is they have a guy that comes through the program, an individual or a gal that comes through the program, an individual that comes through the program, and they get lots of people mentoring them through sort of an organized way. So Techstars is this way, Y Combinator is this way. I would call that mentoring, but I would call mentoring as sort of a many-to-one mentoring, which is we're mentoring this thing. This thing might be a person or it might be a company, but we have all these people around it that are providing that mentorship. So as an example, I'm not a very good mentor, one-on-one. I'm an extremely good mentor at an early stage when you're saying, how do I get my first sale? I've done it a lot, I know how to do it. I also can be incredibly empathetic about how hard it is. But if you said, Tom, I don't really know what my balance sheet should look like 2 years into your venture when you're going to raise money, I'd be like, great, neither do I. I can tell you what I see that doesn't work, but I can't tell you what it should look like. Okay? There are people that can. Models. Declare victory. Point out the model, be that guy's awesome. So I went through the Sioux City Journal, just went through and I typed in entrepreneur just because I wanted to see. As far as I can tell, the last 30 articles that they have written about models were from other places. New York, Silicon Valley, Des Moines. It's not an indictment of the journal. In fact, that's what I expected to find, because that's what is true. But how do you change conventional wisdom if you don't know who it is? How do you know who it is if you don't have a mechanism that does that? So the reason Silicon Prairie News is world-class is because they give an asynchronous mechanism to communicate information of that type. They basically say, you need to know this guy. He's that guy 20 years from now you're going to want to know. He's Ben Milne when Ben Milne wasn't a big deal, the guy from Guam. Ben Milne, the first time I met him, had $0 in revenue, no product, and literally was sort of like, I don't really know what I'm doing. Can you help introduce me to people that might have a better idea? First time I met him, he'd already had 4 articles about him in Silicon Prairie News. Because he's super smart, incredibly talented. You can recognize these people on your street. You can see them, and you can do stuff with them today. Declare victory. This guy's awesome. Are you going to look stupid sometimes? Yes. Because you know what? Inside entrepreneurship, people fail. All right. Financial capital. So this is probably what I get paid to talk about the most, but I'm not going to talk that much about it. I'm going to say 3 things are really important to financial capital that people usually talk about quantity. Quantity is less important than liquidity, transparency, and governance. Liquidity. I make an investment. I need to be able to get out of that investment eventually. It doesn't mean I need to have a $1 billion exit. It means if the next investment walks in, I need to have some liquid cash so I can go make that investment. So there's a guy in Omaha I know who made an investment. It was in a software logistics company associated with trash hauling, if that really matters. But they've had tremendous success. He held it for 4 years. They'd gone from something like $200,000 in revenue to about $12 million in revenue. He could not find anybody that would get him out at anything less than a 50% discount. Huge problem. So when you talk about capital, one of the big issues is how quickly can your capital turn? It's not just, can we make investments? That first investment is critically important. And I'm guessing that you have gaps above $5,000, because $5,000 is available, between, we'll say 20 and 100. I'm guessing you have a capital problem between 2 and 4, and you have a capital problem above 20, because everybody does. There's almost nowhere in the country, Silicon Valley and New York are the only 2 places. Even Boston struggles at the early dollars. But if you have that liquidity, you don't need a ton of capital because it will churn. Number 2, transparency. People have to know what terms are. They have to know stuff about each other. That dude's a bad dude. Don't do a deal with him. That guy's a pain in the ass. Don't do a deal with him. This guy, bad entrepreneur, stole my money. The number 1 thing that happened in Omaha, knowledgeable community. Silicon Prairie News. Made us so much smarter. Made us smarter because now we knew what was going on, and it made us smarter because now we had a conduit to have conversations we had never had before. So, there's a group called, is it Group 29, I-29, Think 29? Think 29. Read their blogs, pretty good. There are things like Create a Fire on their system, has some good stuff. That powerful messaging has to be the sort of thing that you are starting to identify and figure out how you can tell that story so that everybody, and I'll give you my example that I usually give. I don't have a ton of time, so I'm not trying to rush through it. I just want to make sure we cover everything. There's like 1 more slide. But I was standing in a Starbucks, which I do a lot if you can't tell. I drink a lot of coffee. Standing in a Starbucks, I was standing behind 2 women that I will refer to as soccer moms, not inappropriately, but because they were actually talking about soccer. They were talking about their kids, and then they were talking about one of them's husband had started a business. So in my job, I'm like, oh, business. And they said the word venture capital. So those words are like magnets for my ears. And like, even if you're trying to be polite and not really listen, you're really like, oh my gosh, what? What's going on here? And I started talking. I'm kind of going, oh, this is interesting. Guy got $1 million. And I'm kind of, I'm moving closer in line because they're kind of to start a restaurant. It's not venture capital. It's risk capital. There's a big difference between those 2. This is what knowledgeable community is about. That at your PTA meetings, you have an entrepreneur. You have somebody that knows that lingo. When you're standing in line at Starbucks, is the lingo correct? Do you have common knowledge about stuff going on in your community? Or does everybody stand up, PKI is awesome! We start all kinds of stuff there. Not true. That's what having a knowledgeable community means. You need to be on the same page as a community about what's really happening. Part of that's honesty, but a lot of it is how do you have that communication when I'm not directly getting it from the guy or the gal who's doing it? I don't know. Push that back to you. Last piece, infrastructure. Whew. I'm going to say something that will probably get me kicked out of the room. It's not about sites and pipes. All that old smokestack chasing stuff, push to the side. If you're starting a company today, what do you need? A lot less than you used to. If you're starting an ecosystem, you need to have things that bring people together. The infrastructure for an ecosystem inside of this, or frankly, most industries today, is actually people. So how do you leverage the talent of people inside of infrastructure? Events, mentoring programs, university-related stuff. There's a whole bunch that I could lump in here. Our one big success. I would put public policy in here. Public policy is sort of basically anything, but I'm going to specifically talk about legislative prospects. In 2006, when we sort of got started, I would argue that Nebraska was in the bottom 10 when it comes to public policy for startups. Bottom 10. You could maybe say, oh, we were actually bottom quartile, which puts us in the bottom 12 and a half, but we were clearly bad. When we had a conversation at the state level, literally we had no conversation because nobody had the lingo to have the conversation. If you don't have a knowledgeable base of people, whether it's administrative folks or legislators or, you know, governors, mayors, etc. If you don't have that, it's very difficult to create an environment where change is possible. So the first thing is you got to educate on public policy. So it took a couple years. Today, I would argue that Nebraska is in the top quartile, maybe even in the top 5 for entrepreneurial public policy at the state level. Angel tax credits, prototype grants, commercialization grants, SBIR Phase 0 match, SBIR Phase 1 match, SBIR Phase 2 match. They have a deal that was there before, which is why we weren't dead last, but we had to fight to keep it in place, which allows folks that basically exit a position. So I sell my company to not have to take a state income tax or capital gains tax one time every 5 years on an individual company. So if you sell Gateway and you make $1 billion, you don't pay any state income tax. We have a ton of great things in Nebraska that we never had before. This is not a recruitment pitch. It's a pitch about that conversation doesn't happen overnight. You have to do so much work to get to that place. And yet, I would say it's a tremendous success, not of me. I had some of those conversations, but of a collective saying, we think this really matters. And I'm going to talk to my senator, unicameral in Nebraska, so we only have senators. I'm going to talk to my senator. I'm going to do these things. I'm going to have Silicon Prairie News. I'm going to champion those things. Super hard, super hard. And yet, we did it. All right, now I have to say the other thing that will probably get me kicked out of this room. You're not going to win alone. You're not going to win alone. You know what? You don't have enough customers in the Sioux City or the Siouxland region that you can import wealth from them. What you need is customers. Where you can find them easily is that region. You need to go to Sioux Falls and find out what Citibank wants. You need to go to Omaha and figure out what HDR is buying. And the best way to do that is to create the relationships with people like me, or like Andy, or other people that are regional partners. You are no longer in competition with Sioux Falls in this space. You're not. Sioux Falls' success impacts you not at all. Sioux Falls' failure impacts you in tremendous ways. Because if they don't have a network you can tap into, you can't sell stuff there very effectively as a startup. So I leverage my network every day. I'll give you an example. Yesterday I was on a call with Cerner Corporation. People know Cerner? The way I got to Cerner was a guy named Thad Langford. Thad is at Open Air Equity. Thad started Zave Networks. Thad has been the guy that sold the first time I said, hey, I don't know if we need to talk to Cerner or not, but we kind of like an intro. I don't know anybody there. Do you? He said, yeah, I think I maybe know somebody. Thad put me in touch with Clay Patterson. Clay Patterson is Neil Patterson's son and in charge of their corporate venture world. It was the exact right guy. If I'm fighting with Kansas City, if I'm saying Omaha's going to crush Kansas City, we hate you, Thad, we're going to kick your ass. You think Thad's going to connect me to my customer? No, he's not. This is going to require you to jump back and be like, we love Sioux Falls. It's not the butt of our jokes. So when you talk about Silicon Prairie, that's the Silicon Prairie right there. We talk all the time, Andy and I, and we never see each other, despite the fact that we live 15 minutes from each other. We talk in places like Cedar Rapids and Sioux City, because we know it's critically important that he in Cedar Rapids and I in Lincoln and Omaha are able to connect our customers. I'm an advisor. Nebraska Global doesn't invest outside of Nebraska. I'm an advisor in companies all over this region. Des Moines, Cedar Rapids, Kansas City. I have helped about $8 million worth of dollars flow to folks that I have no interest in whatsoever as an investor, because they're outside of my work. Because it's critically important for me that those people succeed. Not because I get anything out of it other than the opportunity potentially to say at some point, hey John, I need a favor. Hey John, what's happening in Cedar Rapids? We need to get smarter. Hey John, we're going to go to the state. John's in Cedar Rapids, by the way. We're going to go to the state and we want to change this policy because it really hurts our entrepreneurs in Sioux City. Will you help us? Cedar Rapids and Sioux City are not competing. You guys should be collaborating. All right. I think that's it. I think I might have one. Oh, I got to tell these real quick. Bob, I'm sorry. I know you want questions. Do not allow negativity to persist. Crush the negativity. When people say, it's the startup's fault, it is never the startup's fault. If they're dishonest, maybe. You know, if they're cheating, fine. It's not the startup's fault that they failed. They may have failed because they're not very good at what they were supposed to do. They couldn't find a customer. They couldn't find capital. There's lots of reasons they failed. But don't be like startups stink because of blah, 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 blah. This happens everywhere. This is one of the fundamental problems that we have. Number two, if you're a service organization, do not get enamored with a single company. There's a company in Nebraska right now. I love the guy who started it. It's a terrible company. I have been enamored with that company. Don't fall into that trap. Because once you get enamored with a single company, you say, every company has to look like that. I found a company when I was in Philadelphia called Optera. I'd never heard of them. They're an Omaha-based company that does LiDAR and LADAR stuff to help build blueprints. This is how I figured out that we were good at built landscape technology. This opened a whole swath of stuff. But if I had fallen in love with just Optera, I would have failed. Because I wouldn't have found Census Machine Intelligence, I wouldn't have found Beehive, I wouldn't have found a bunch of companies that were sitting below them that were actually more interesting. Put off measurement. You got to do it today. Shame on Andy for not doing this. You got to measure stuff, even if it highlights a challenge. Even if you're like, oh my gosh, we are really terrible at this. You got to measure today, because if you don't, you'll never do it. Do not fall in love with a single challenge or a single solution. We're going to solve the financial capital problem from 50,000 to 100,000. An ecosystem requires you to solve all 5 of those things. Human capital is the hardest. I would spend the most amount of time there, but don't just do that unless you're so good at it that all the other stuff takes care of itself. Entrepreneurship is in vogue. You have a chance to win because nobody's ahead of you. You know why? Because you're the tortoise, they're the hare. Startup people are more important than companies. Startup people are more important than incubators. Startup people are more important than events. Find those people, love those people, do what they want. Get as many of them together as you can. It's a people-centric thing. Focus on people. Play to your strengths. Humbly understand your personal role. Here's what my personal role was and is. My personal role is to go out and talk like this in a suit. That's it. My job was not to start companies. It wasn't to provide advice. When I was at the Chamber of Commerce, I had no legitimacy anywhere but rooms full of suits. I was the startup guy to those guys. To the startups, I was the suits. Know your role. Accept it. I'm a different dude now. I can sort of roll in a t-shirt and jeans, and people are like, yeah, he's real. He's legit. I drop things like agile methodology in rooms like this, and people are like, whoa, what's that about? I'm a different guy than I was then. Know your role. Be okay with that role. Chambers of Commerce. I'm going to say one thing about Chambers of Commerce. Chambers of Commerce should not lead. Chambers of Commerce are great at collecting data. Collect data. You're great at measuring stuff. You're great at connecting. Number one feature of a Chamber of Commerce, connect. You can do more for your community by helping a startup get their first customer than you can by doing almost anything else. We did that 6 times, a total of 6 successful. All of those companies still exist today, and they're all chamber members. You know what? We didn't ask them to be a member first. We didn't say, you got to pay us to help you do this thing. We said, let us help you today. If you fail, oh well. 6 times we did it. They're all members. You know how many more members we have because we helped 6 companies? About 50. How many did we ask? 0. We helped all of those people peripherally by doing lots of other stuff, and they became members. I've talked to lots of communities. The first thing Chamber says is, how do I get a member to do this? I want a member to be in my incubator. I want a member to do all this stuff. It's a bad strategy. Don't pay to play. In Lincoln right now, the #1 thing that I've been arguing against, I mean literally I have this conversation, we have co-working space, we have other things, is all of the events are pay to play. You have to pay to show up. You know how many entrepreneurs are there? 0. There's lots of people that claim to be entrepreneurs. There are no entrepreneurs. You know why? We're too busy. I'm going to go pay $10 to hang out with guys that want to sell me insurance. All right. Last word, thanks.